Okay. So again, thanks so much everybody for coming here. It's a great pleasure to be here in the museum and to be sort of leading this conversation about Ukraine, because I'm Ukrainian and I came to this country last year as one of the 180,000 Ukrainian war refugees. And it's an even bigger pleasure to be here with Andy, because I think he did a fantastic job with writing his book We Play On, which we will be discussing as well, the situation with Ukraine in general and Ukrainian football. So I think we can start this off by just introducing ourselves, and I will go first. For those who don't know me, my name is Maria Romanenko. I'm a journalist like Andy. I'm a journalist, and I've been a journalist since 2016, and I worked in Ukraine, and I was at one point the chief editor of an English language publication in Ukraine called Hromadske International, and then I've freelanced for a lot of publications. And then since coming here last year, I think my role kind of shifted from not just being a journalist, but also being an activist and doing the free walking tours for Ukrainian war refugees in the country, and translating, interpreting, and just helping in any ways I can. I get invited to do stuff like this, which obviously is amazing, and also just talking on behalf of Ukraine, on behalf of Ukrainians, and advocating for peace and freedom for Ukraine. Andy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. My name's Andy Brassell. I've been a writer and broadcaster for probably the best part of 20 years. I ended up doing this book, because I'm sure we'll come to, having seen a lot of Shakhtar on various work trips and stuff. I ended up doing a film for The Guardian in Ukraine about Shakhtar, about a year after the invasion of Donbass, so in 2015, because that was 2014. And the idea to do the book sort of grew from there. Apart from that, I feel a little bit underdressed because I'm not wearing the incredible football shirt that Maria's got in. That's you can't see from here, but it's kind of Plianka.
I mean, I can
just
do this gracefully and just drop everything whilst I do it.
Half turn.
It's Yevhen Konoplyanka, who was actually also a Shakhtar player, as I only just found out, for 2 years.
Yeah.
Apparently he didn't do really well, but I think he was at the end of his career. Well,
he was there.
Still playing.
Yeah,
he's still playing. He's currently playing for Cluj in Romania, but for quite a while he was in the national team for Ukraine. And this particular shirt is actually match worn. So it was worn in 2012 when Ukraine, as well as Poland, hosted Euro 2012. And this is from, I don't know if you can see from there, but this is from the Ukraine-England game on 19th of June 2012, and guess where the game happened? It was in Donetsk. So I thought this would be a nice and fitting shirt to wear today, and not just because of that, but also because I actually bought this in Manchester. In Manchester, there is now a Ukrainian retro football shirt shop on South King Street, which is run by Ukrainian war refugees, and they sell stuff like this, and they sell lots of retro shirts from Manchester City, United, and all of the sort of teams, Amsterdam, you know, all of the countries. So it's a really, really fantastic shop. I actually thought that Serge and Polina would be here today, but unfortunately couldn't join. But if you do get a chance, go in, say hello, and try out different shirts. So I guess, Andy, you kind of already talked a bit about how the idea for the book came to be. I know that you did a documentary first and foremost, but how can you talk a bit about writing about football in Ukraine in previous years, and how it kind of was a natural journey for you to start covering Shakhtar? How was that interest bred in you?
Well, I guess like where the Shakhtar seed was planted is the same that most football ones are, actually on the pitch, because I think the first time I covered a Shakhtar game was probably about 2006, 2007. And by then, the club are very deep already into recruiting Brazilian players, into developing this brand of football, a sort of mini Barcelona, or I guess Barcelona of the East, as are referred to them in the book. And it was just mesmeric, actually, the first time I saw them, because I wasn't that familiar with the club, wasn't that familiar with a lot of the players, but they had a really distinct way of playing. You know, sometimes when you turn up to play five-a-side on a Monday night or a Thursday night or whenever you play it. And the other team are amazing, and you're just there catching your breath and you're looking around at your friends going, who are these? Where are they from? It was kind of like that, but in visual form, really. And you speak to other people, and other people's first Shakhtar experience from any point between, I guess, about 2006 to 2013 is like that as well. So I covered them a few more times. It was easy to get chatting to them and to get to know a little bit about the players because they had a lot of Brazilians around then. When Michel Lucescu, the Romanian coach, was really obsessed with Brazilian football and a Portuguese speaker, first arrived at the club, he made a point of getting loads of Brazilian players there. And so he spoke Spanish and Portuguese, so I could ask him questions and understand his press conferences. I could speak to the players after the game because I speak Portuguese. So that was handy as well. It's not like being after a Dynamo Kiev game at the same time where you're just scribbling around to see like if anyone can speak like a little bit of English. So I got to know a bit about them from that and sort of saw them regularly. And then, of course, came 2014 because there's a before and after that. So the story of this not just extremely good team, but extremely rich club, extremely well-funded, looked after in this space-age stadium, the Donbass Arena, all of a sudden becoming the biggest homeless club in the world. It was an extraordinary story to me. I followed it really closely. Going and doing this film in Ukraine, in Kiev, where they were living and training at the time, and Lviv, where they were playing the games. It had quite an effect on me. And so I followed it from there, and someone approached me about the idea of a book, and it sort of like grew in my mind over time. And then the right time sort of arrived, I suppose, at least partly because obviously the story is the story of Ukraine has taken a really, really sad turn in the last year and a half. But it means it's all the more important to tell that story. I mean, I just finished writing a book when I started writing this, and writing a book is like it's quite an all-consuming thing. Like you go to bed and you're thinking about it, and you wake up and you're thinking about it. You're not trying to, but it's just there in your mind until it's done. Especially that bit where you're halfway through and you think, actually, it's too late to back out now. I really do have to do this.
Especially when you have a deadline. I guess.
Yeah, exactly. But if I'd have been like asked to do this book at any other time, any other book, I would have said no because I just finished writing the last one, and I needed a bit of a time out from it. But just to be asked to do this, I didn't. It's not that I wanted to write it. I felt compelled to write it really, because by then I obviously knew the club well, knew some of the players and some of the people who worked there, and I knew the story intimately going back many years. So I felt like I needed to help tell it or help tell these people's story as best I could.
And how did you choose, can you talk a bit about the research process? You interview a lot of great friends, great people who are also happen to be my friends, like Andrei Teodors and Paul Nyland. How did you plan this process of who you're going to interview? How did that research take place? And was it harder because since the start of the full-scale invasion, because people are in different countries, different places, they travel, and as you said, they kind of became, I think, a homeless club back in 2014, but the things from last year have all taken it up to another level. Was that a difficult process for you?
Well, I think it's an easier process, actually, Maria, than it would have been pre-COVID, because as a journalist, you know, when you've got a story, your first instinct is, let's go out there, let's go to the place, let's meet the people. But obviously that wasn't possible in COVID. So the way you look at doing things becomes a little bit different. On one hand, COVID was an incredibly limiting time, as it was for a lot of people in a difficult time. But in terms of working remotely, it actually opens the world up. Because places that would be difficult to get to, you think, well, actually I can just have a Zoom meeting with someone, and you get talking to people, and of course you don't get the same sense of their personality if you're in the room with them. It's still much preferable, and I still feel grateful to be able to do things like this and see people in the flesh. But it's something that made getting started on that quite a bit easier. I think the fact that I was familiar with Ukraine and I knew a lot of people there really helped as well. I mean, the first time I went to Kyiv was probably about 2008, 2009. I had friends there. I had friends who lived there as well. So, you talked about Paul Nyland, for example, who's activist and runs a mental health charity over.
Yeah, he's a great guy and does an absolute. So Paul Nyland he's actually Irish, but he lived in the UK for I think a good few years, and he has some close ties to Manchester. He's a United fan, but he's been living in Kiev for the last, I think, 15 years at least, I think, because when Euromaidan revolution happened, he was there every day, and you mentioned this in the book. And right now he's running a charity since 2014 that was primarily, when it was set up, it was for war veterans, because the suicide rates among war veterans are actually really, really high everywhere in the world, and in Ukraine in particular. So it started as a suicide prevention hotline, but these days it helps everybody, not just soldiers, regular civilians, and their calls have risen sixfold since the start of the full-scale invasion. So if you just can try and imagine the scope of how the war actually affects people, civilians, football players as well, which we'll probably come to later.
Yeah, so Paul is a friend of a friend from a friend of mine from university who lived in Kyiv for a couple of years. So that's there were just a load of, when I said it, how I was sort of compelled to write the book, there were just a load of signposts on the way that said it's meant to be. Like I was in Kyiv the weekend that Euromaidan started, for example, on a friend's 40th birthday, and we were going out to do some like wholesome activity in a minibus, and you could just see the streets were just absolutely full of people. It's difficult to describe because it was almost like a festival in the sort of density of people that were on the streets. You couldn't see an inch of pavement anywhere, and there was a sense of being at the start of something really happening. But going back to what you were asking about interviewing people, the other half of that was the first bit of that, I guess, of your question is like the connections I already had in Ukraine. The second part of it is the club is just incredibly open. So if you've worked in football for a bit, you'll know that clubs don't really want to give you anything. Like the biggest clubs, they want to carefully guard their image, and they want to just drip feed you little bits. You almost have to beg for access, really, which I think when ESPN had the rights to the Premier League for a little bit, they're obviously a US company, and they're used to a culture where you just stroll into the locker room and chat with the players while they're in their pants and all that sort of stuff. And all of a sudden, you're made to stand on the outside, and it's like, yes, you are paying a lot of money for this product, but we will give you a tiny little bit when we feel like it. And they're kind of like, what's that about? So I think if you've grown up as a journalist in that sort of context, and this club says, come in, what do you want to know? Who do you want to speak to? You're like, well, okay. It's amazing, and but it's not just the access that Shakhtar and their players and their staff gave in terms of their time. It was the fact that they were just so incredibly open and honest about their experiences as well. It wasn't stock answers. These people really told you about what they went through. So I did have that feeling all the time of being able to tell their story quite authentically.
You mentioned obviously how by hiring all those Brazilians, I think kind of goes without saying that Shakhtar management, they kind of revolutionized Ukrainian football because that's never been seen before.
Yeah.
And I think they still are as being the best Ukrainian football club at the moment. But I guess with hiring all those Brazilians, that actually ended up being a difficulty in a way when the full-scale invasion happened. And all of them had families in other countries that were all really worried about what's going to happen to the players. And you mentioned this in the book, how they were all based sort of near the opera in Kiev. Can you talk a bit about that impact of the full-scale invasion and how it forced to what the next step for the team were? You know, how did they all deal with that, and how did they move on from that to playing in Kiev again?
Yeah, I mean, at the start of the invasion, it sounds an awful thing to say, really, but Shakhtar were better prepared for this than any other Ukrainian club, or probably any other club in the world, because they've been through it before in 2014. You know, these guys had to leave their houses, leave their possessions overnight. And, you know, I think we think of footballers quite rightly a lot of the time as like very privileged and wealthy and lucky. But I think you realise when you listen to their stories that however much wealth you've got, it's no protection from war. You know, if that's what's happening, you know, I think Dario Siena, the sporting director of Shakhtar and one of their most famous players, saying to me was, you know, the day that he left his house in Donetsk, that they had to go like that, and so all his things, like all his clothes, all his wife's clothes, the children's things, they're still in there. He left his watch collection, so all still in there. Car on the driveway, everything, and he's just never been back, and that to me is like remarkable. That's something that happens to someone who we consider privileged. So I think if you extrapolate that experience to what like normal people must have experienced, you know, people of like working class means, it's something that you can't really get your head around. It's something that's really, really extreme. So that was really something. Actually, I wanted to ask you. You talked about the Brazilians, and obviously they were, well, not obviously, but after like the full-scale Russian invasion in February 2022, they all gather in this hotel, the Hotel Opera, that belongs to the owner, Rina Akhmetov, and has been their sort of de facto headquarters since they moved out of Donetsk in 2014. They all meet there. Eventually, after 2 days, they find a way to get the Brazilian players out by coach. They go by coach over the border. They're going to Moldova, and then fly home from there. And that changes everything for Shakhtar, because of course they've started playing again, but a very different team to before. There's like one Brazilian there now, so who's just been brought in, quite a young player. But they're a very different team. Speaking to some Ukrainians, they say they feel a greater kinship with Shakhtar than before because they're younger and because they're more Ukrainian. Has what has happened changed the way that you as a Ukrainian feels about Shakhtar in any way?
Yeah, I think there's an interest. We've talked about this before a couple of times. There's a very interesting difference between the Ukrainian football fan culture and British football fan culture, because obviously the initial Russian invasion in 2014, that so many people tried to divide Ukraine after that and say, you know, this is Eastern Ukraine, Western Ukraine. It's still really, I really hate when people use those words. I think it should be East and West of Ukraine, because nobody divides England like that. Nobody says Northern England or says Western England. You know, it's all North, East. So I think that's kind of wrong word. And then a lot of people try to do that and say Russian speak and Ukrainian speak. And as a reaction to that, as I don't know how many of you guys are local here, but it's very often in different places as a reaction to something very negative. If you guys are from Manchester, you might remember the Ariana Grande bombing, when people united and there were huge queues to get be tattoos, and people show that they are united and they support each other. So I think in a different but similar way, the initial Russian invasion in 2014, Ukrainians try to show that we support each other, we love each other, and don't divide us, don't say that these people are like this, these people are like that, we all one country. So these days, and it all kind of lingers on to these days, and especially since the sort of second stage of this war last year, it's that Ukrainians, they support any Ukrainian football club that does well. We stand behind any team. So me from Kiev, I'm supposed to be supporting Dynamo Kiev, but unfortunately they've not really been showing any good results for a good few years. So when Shakhtar does well, I'm very happy to support Shakhtar. And likewise, I think for most people, unless they like die-hard fans, Dynamo fans will support Shakhtar team when it does well. And likewise, and you'll have this thing where after a game, the fans will hug each other, and that would never happen here. And I know this because my partner made me come to Liverpool United game, and that was horrible. I did not enjoy that at all. And I thought when people were warning me before going to that game, they were like, oh, just be careful there. I thought they were joking. I was like, oh, how bad can it be? And then I saw it, and there was police separating the fans, and there were people shouting the swear words at each other, and I was like, oh my God. So that never happens in Ukraine anymore. We stand behind each other, we support each other. I'm happy to support any Ukrainian football club that does well, meaning only Shakhtar, and support the national team whenever they play. I tried to go, last year in the summer I went to Cardiff and I went to Glasgow to support Ukraine when they played Scotland and Wales respectively, and then I went to Wembley Stadium when Ukraine played England a few months ago. It kind of is a thing that unites us, and some people will criticize and say, why does Ukraine need football these days? There's a war. Why does the national team even play? Why does Ukraine participate in Eurovision? Surely they should all be sort of just doing concentrate on the war efforts. And it kind of makes sense, but until you actually are in those conditions, when you realize that if you don't distract yourself, you'll go crazy. If it's all about the war and you don't listen to music and you don't watch the national team play or the football club play, you'll just go crazy. You need these other things, and you need humor, and you need dark humor, because all of these things, they just release the pressure. And that's where football comes in. It's actually something very special for Ukraine, because it allows people to distract themselves and unite by watching something together.
Yeah, I think that's it. Like, the fact is that news cycles move on. People get desensitized to stuff, don't they? So for Ukraine to continue being important to people who are non-Ukrainian, people who can make a difference, that's where what Shakhtar does or what Eurovision does, it's all really important, isn't it? To keep people talking about Ukraine the whole time. And I get the sense from Shakhtar's players and staff, they definitely feel that responsibility. Of course, they were playing their Champions League games and the Europa League games in Warsaw last season, and they received an enormous amount of goodwill. But I think there was a sense of preaching to the converted to a certain extent, because, as your shirt says on the sleeve, there's this there's this relationship between Poland and Ukraine. There's a very close relationship between Poland and Ukraine, and so that was more a neighbourly thing. But I know it was the subject of a lot of discussion in the club. What were they going to do? Where were they going to stage their games this season in Europe? Because obviously UEFA forbids them to stage them in Ukraine. And they came to this solution, and they played Barcelona and beat Barcelona this week in Hamburg.
And that was probably something special. I heard it was the best Shakhtar game in like 15 years. Would you agree with that?
It was amazing. It was amazing. They were great. They totally deserved to win. They didn't steal it at all. It was a fantastic display. But the atmosphere there was really, really interesting, because their idea was to play those games, in a bigger stadium, because the stadium in Hamburg is like half as big again as the Legia one where they played them in Warsaw last year. But also, I guess to platform Ukraine to a bigger market and a different market, I think was the thing. Now, Hamburg's quite a good choice because Hamburg's a huge football city, as you might know, that has not had any success for absolutely ages. Both their big teams are in the second division at the moment. And there were these adverts all around the town that says, come and see Champions League football at the Volkspark Stadion. It might not involve your team, but come and see it. And I think that was a draw for people. And the atmosphere was something special because, of course, there were a lot of Ukrainians there and a lot of expat Ukrainians there as well. But there were also a lot of German Barcelona supporters there as well, because Barcelona are a huge name all over the world. So rather than you had the games in Warsaw, you had this quite exhibition match kind of feel, because you had people who wanted to come and see the game and wanted to show their support for Shakhtar and show their support for Ukraine. But you only really feel it if it's your own team, don't you? Whereas this time, because there were two sets of fans, there were Shakhtar fans and there were Barcelona fans, albeit German-based Barcelona fans. There was a bit more back and forth. There was a bit of what you were talking about before, that sort of gentle booing, getting after the referee, players who you feel have stitched up your team, all that sort of stuff. And it just felt more real as well as being on a big scale. And you could feel, as Shakhtar were making this amazing thing happen, beating Barcelona, a club that has, tens of times the budget that they do, that you could tell people were getting whipped up in that feeling of, we're being part of a moment here, because that idea in Germany is very much part of football culture. The fact that you're not just an observer, you're not just a voyeur, you're part of the experience. You're there to add to the experience, and I think people felt that definitely.
Yeah, and I also wanted to ask, I think maybe one of the last things before we move on to questions, to Q&A. You touched upon it briefly, but the importance of having a home stadium to play in. And Donbas Arena, that was something really, really special. I think it was built just a couple of years before Euro 2012, specifically for the tournament. And you talk in the book about how special and how it actually gave a kick, a push for Shakhtar to do better, because as soon as they got this fancy new stadium, which was really, really impressive, they started actually playing better. And during the opening night, Beyonce came and performed when the stadium was open. It was something really, really special for the city, and it allowed Donetsk to kind of also put itself on the map as well, because not many modern things were happening in the city, I guess. And then obviously the Russian invasion of the Donbas happened, and they had to move out, even though they did try to also come there a couple of times and do trainings and stuff, which I also found interesting. I didn't know that Shakhtar players tried to go back to the stadium after the invasion. And then they played in different cities, and they keep changing their sort of home stadium. What's the importance of having one stadium to play in, and how hard it is for the team to keep moving between different cities and not have that home base of fans following them?
I think it means everything, home in football, really, because every football club is identified by the place where it's from. I think it's quite interesting now when we talk about Shakhtar. I don't hear them called Shakhtar Donetsk much. People call them Shakhtar because...
Which means a miner in Ukrainian, actually.
Yeah,
because Donetsk is a city of miners, so coal mining was a very, very big industry there for a long time.
So in that sense, they'll never lose where they're from as long as they're called Shakhtar. You're right. But I think the fact that Donetsk is kind of parked, it's a semi-recognition that it's really difficult to imagine the point where they go back, which is really sad to say. And people at the club, and almost everyone who works at board level in the club and just below, almost all of those people are from Donetsk. It's a family affair. Those people have all worked at the club for 20 years, most of them. So there is a feeling that they're all together and they are representing that region, that city, even though they are far away. But yeah, home's enormously important. And actually, I spoke. As part of the book, I spoke to Taras Stepanenko, the captain of Shakhtar, and he was saying, though, when they got to a point, I guess for the couple of years before the full Russian invasion, where they were training, and they've got an arrangement to play in Kyiv as well. And it's something we never really think about for footballers, but he said the difference between going from being a team that takes 150 flights a year, like you're just on this conveyor belt, going from that to you finish a home game in Kyiv, and okay, it's not quite your home, it's still a Dynamo city, of course, but the fact that you can come off the pitch, get changed, get showered, and you're home to your wife and children in like 20 minutes. He said that made an enormous difference to his state of mind and to others players' state of mind, because he's someone who, even when he's speaking English, his second language, Stepanenko, he chooses his words very carefully, and you know he spoke like quite engagingly and quite openly about how, and again this is the bit where we never really think about footballers off the pitch, how a lot of his teammates had experienced depression because of that, not just the anxiety of war, but the anxiety of being away from your family all the time, of constantly being travelling, of never feeling at home. So I think, maybe I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the thread of your question was about a football club being at home. But it's about the players as well, the players as human beings, I think, what they experience. And they're in this weird holding pattern now, because lots of them, they have their base still inside Ukraine. They travel abroad for the Champions League matches. But a lot of them, their families are off living somewhere else. They're in Spain and Portugal. And, you know, I think you need stability for your family. Those guys have done the right thing, you know, to make sure that their family is safe and stable and their children can be children. But for them, in a situation where you only see your family like your immediate family every 6 weeks or something, it's hard. And to not know when that is going to end as well. I think that's the difficult bit, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I had one more question, but I think we probably have to move on to Q&As. No? Okay. I want to talk about the Ukrainian, I don't know how much you follow this, but the Ukrainian football players who play within the UK, because that subject actually quite really interests me. You know, I've written articles about the representation of Ukrainian culture in the UK. Some of them, I think Mudryk actually played for Shakhtar. Was he part of the academy?
Yeah, he was.
Part of
he
the
was,
academy.
yeah.
So how much do you follow these players and their successes? Can you talk a bit more about the Ukrainian talent that we have in the UK? Obviously, Zinchenko is the main one, but he hasn't got a connection to Shakhtar.
He did actually. He was in the academy at Shakhtar,
okay.
And he went off to when there was the invasion of Donbass. He went off to play in Russia for a bit actually, and then he eventually made his way to Manchester.
But he said, I think in your book, it was in your book that quote that I just don't want to talk about it. I just want to erase that bit from my life. Or,
exactly. He spoke about that to Krishna Guru Murthy, I think, on Channel 4 as well. But yeah, I think Mudryk's really interesting. Really interesting. Not just because he's the most expensive
football transfer in the history of Ukraine.
Exactly. But I think it's the fact that it's just got this undeniable star quality. And I went with my kids, actually, to the Tottenham Shakhtar charity match just before the start of the season. And, you know, my kids were... I was doing a bit of work with Tottenham, so my kids were lucky enough to get pitch side with me and stuff. And, you know, Harry Kane, it was his last game before he went, was... like running past, and you know, my kids were just whatever about that. But when Mudryk, who of course is at Chelsea now, came into the director's box, my son was like, he's tugging my arm. My younger son, he's like, "Oh my God, Daddy, it's Ricardo Mudryk!" And he was going absolutely crazy. And he's like, "Can we ask him for an autograph?" And he was hiding under a cap. He was hiding that blonde hair under a cap, so people didn't recognise him. But my son saw his neck tattoo, and it's like, it's definitely him. So he does have that star quality, but also the way that he's become that star, I think is fascinating in the context of modern Shakhtar, because maybe at any other time he would still just be a squad player for Shakhtar, maybe not even the 11 in the 11, because his path would have been blocked by all the brilliant Brazilian players they had already. Of course, at the time of the full invasion, Roberto De Zerbi, who's now the coach of Brighton, he was the coach there, building a very ambitious, exciting team. And Mudryk was just used for little substitute appearances here and there. But when all those players go, when they have to restructure the team, when the team's a bit weaker and they have to play in a more defensive way in last year's Champions League, it kind of platforms Mudryk, because all of a sudden they defend and it turns out here's this guy who can run as fast as Usain Bolt, so every time they counter-attack, whoosh, over the top, and it's like, look at this guy. And he becomes this superstar almost overnight, because not only do we see his qualities, not only does he become the torchbearer for Shakhtar, but the way they play, like, sort of platforms him. It sticks him on this pedestal, really. And I think the other interesting thing about him is he speaks about Shakhtar's modern history, because he's not from Donetsk. He's not from Zaporizhia. He's not from anywhere over there. He's someone who grew up in the western part of Ukraine, and he's someone who developed in their academy after the academy had moved. Because initially their idea was, as you say, to retain that link with Donbass, but logistically it was just impossible in the end. So he's someone who's grown up in a post-Donetsk Shakhtar, if you like, and has made an enormous success of it as well. How do you feel about him as a Ukrainian? Are you as awed by him as my son, or is that just not possible?
Well, from what I understand, he's not actually. I know there were a lot of expectations from him. I think it took a while till he had his first international goal just recently, I think, wasn't it? So I think he's kind of still sort of waiting to brewing up to sort of have to show himself and prove himself, and I really hope he does. But obviously, I loved, when Zinchenko played here in Manchester. It was actually really, really exciting to have because I think he's probably the best Ukrainian player that you have now. Back in the days when I first sort of was coming to England, it was all about like Shevchenko, many years ago, when Shevchenko was like Ukrainian, international Ukrainian star, and now I think it's Zinchenko. Everybody knows Zinchenko. And it was I have a quite interesting story, it's just quite short, but it was when we went to my partner is a United supporter, that's why I have to go to this United game. But we went to see United Everton, and obviously Mykolenko plays for Everton, which is another Ukrainian player. And I was sat in the United section, and I was just sat there saying, like, Mykolenko, come on, Mykolenko. And my partner was like, shh, you can't do that, you're in the United sector. But it's always like, I really get behind every Ukrainian player that you have here in the UK. It's great to see them sort of doing so well in different clubs. Again, something that allows Ukrainians to unite and support somebody. So I support all of the Ukrainian talent that we have.
So how much of the attraction of Zinchenko, for example, is the fact that, like, obviously he's probably the best current Ukrainian player, but how much do you take pride in the fact that he's really articulate off the pitch as well? Because he's much more, let's be honest, he's much more articulate than a normal footballer, isn't he?
He's so fantastic. I mean, it's just, since the full-scale invasion last year, he was just speaking up. It's not just about doing really well in football, but it's also being very vocal about Ukraine and spreading the word, which is something that we all try to do. I try to do that when I give interviews, when I'm invited to do various things, talks and things, and when I do my free walking tours, obviously. And he does that brilliantly. He speaks for Ukraine. He flies that flag. He makes sure that people, because he's somebody that everybody watches, and when it comes from him, it's really, really important. So I think he's doing a fantastic job. I think I've seen a couple of footage where he's crying. At the start of the invasion, he was getting very, very emotional during certain games. And I think there was a game. Was it against Everton when they had two Ukrainian, the Mykolenko and
exactly, the two of them coming together,
and they kind of came together. It was a very, very touching moment. So I think he's a great guy from what I've seen.
Yeah, he's interesting for sure. Yeah.
Right, shall we take some questions if we have any?
Yeah, if anyone just wants to stick your hand up if you've got a question, I can come over with the mic. But I'll throw one out there to start. It'd be interesting to hear about sort of the domestic league in Ukraine. Obviously, we've spoken a little bit about Shakhtar and going to Hamburg for the European fixtures. But what actually happened? You know, did the league continue in a different part of the country, or what was the actual process? You know, thinking particularly around February last year, but even now, I'm not too sure.
Well, I was speaking to one of the coaches, Patrick van Leuven, who actually just got fired by Shakhtar about a month ago. And when he came back to Ukraine, he'd been the coach of the Shakhtar Academy. And when he came back to Ukraine, he told me that the club had sold it to him on that they would play the National League in Poland. And then President Zelensky said, no way, it's symbolically important that we play here, even if it's in front of no fans. So that's what happened. And it can only be played in a limited number of stadiums. It's almost like all the games are being played in neutral stadiums, because even though some teams technically play at home, it has to be a stadium that has a bomb shelter, for example, because you've had games that have lasted up to 5.5 hours, because when the air raid siren goes off, the game stops, all the players have to go down to the bottom, go into the bomb shelter, and once they get the all clear, they go up and go out and continue the match, which is just, it's an extraordinary scenario, really. But what Maria was talking about you needing to find that normality even during wartime, or the closest approximation of normality that you can get, I think is quite interesting. Like I was saying, this guy, Patrick van Leuven, who was brought in after Shakhtar fired their previous coach, Igor Jovicevic, was a big departure for them, because Jovicevic spoke Ukrainian, so I think it was a reflection of he's Croatian, but he spoke Ukrainian, which is a reflection of they wanted someone a bit more domestic, I guess, for a changing demographic of the squad, less Brazilians and more Ukrainian players. He was a great speaker. I really liked him on a personal level. They decided the football wasn't sexy enough. The president decided it wasn't sexy enough, and it's like, so look, you've done a great job. You've helped platform us to Europe, but unfortunately, I want to see better football than that. So, which I think is amazing, and in a way, it's that ultimate normality, isn't it? It's like, you've done a great job. We really appreciate your efforts for Shakhtar in Ukraine, but the football's not good enough, so bye. And the same with Van Leuven. He came in to try and bring that more exciting football. Then after 10 games, they decide it's not working. So, like, even within this extraordinary situation, football has still got the tells that it always did. You've still got a president who says, I want my team to play better than this. I want something a bit more exciting than this. I guess that's the ultimate normality, isn't it? Running your football club like it's just normal times.
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
I'm really enjoying listening to you. First time I saw Shakhtar Donetsk was obviously in the European games, and like what you said before, I was amazed by their style, and I knew it was enhanced by the number of Brazilians in the team. And I think my team, United, ended up with Fred, who was probably not the most dynamic, but
he looked amazing there, didn't he?
Was a football. Well, he was a different sort of player. He was a digger. He did help us out, but I know that from Ukrainian football, Dynamo Kiev were the team for many years. In fact, they were actually the most of the players played in the Russian team.
Yeah.
If I can mention that. They were
the Soviet team, yeah.
They were probably one of the best teams in the world that should have won European Cups. But your focus on Shakhtar is so interesting, because I know that behind that club there must have been some very rich benefactors. And I was wondering how that started. Not only was there a lot of money to get the Brazilians over and to build the club back up again, because I'm sure like all the countries, there was a rivalry. Dynamo Kiev were the team, but Shakhtar actually. So I was just wondering who was there a number of very rich guys who really boosted Shakhtar?
One very rich guy, Rinat Akhmatov, who's still the richest man in Ukraine, despite having, I think that's me, despite having taken some obviously quite heavy losses in the last 10 years, he's still enormously wealthy. So I guess I'll flip this over to Maria in a bit for how Ukrainians look at Akhmatov, because I think it's interesting. He's someone who invested an enormous amount, not just in players but in infrastructure, because of course they built this incredible stadium that we talked about, Donbass Arena, and his idea was to, I guess, bring Donetsk more in touch to the rest of the world. And so on one hand, you've got the internationalization of the team. And the other thing is, you want to invite people to Donetsk. I mean, I remember speaking to a guy who used to play here in Manchester, of course, Fernandinho. Spoke to him when he was still at Shakhtar. And they were playing Chelsea, I think, in the Champions League. And I said to him, if you were a Chelsea fan and you were coming to Donetsk, what would you do? And he's like, I've no idea. I never go out. Like, me and the other Brazilians, we just go around each other's houses, we barbecue, we watch Brazilian TV, and we Skype our mates at home. And that's it, really. And I guess what Akhmatov was trying to do is change that. Obviously building up to Euro 2012, but just building on what he saw as Donetsk's natural gifts, and then making it a bit more in connection with the rest of the world. Now, he's a really controversial figure, really controversial figure in Ukraine, because lots of people saw him with his political dealings as pro-Russian. I would take the view that his political manoeuvres were simply garnered around protecting his business. Exactly. And now he's in a different position, because, for example, his a lot of his business has been taken away. He's lost, I think, 70% of his wealth since the full invasion. Obviously, he's still enormously wealthy, and he still paid, I think, 250 million euros of taxes to the government last year. He's not running short anytime soon. But I think the fact now that he's kind of reinvented himself, hasn't he, Maria, as a sort of humanitarian guy, whereas really he's had no option to do that, because, for example, one of his major businesses, steelworks in Kherson, when that was invaded, they lost 60% of their employees, like with no idea where they are, and about 150 million worth of steel was stolen by the Russian army and taken back to Russia. So, really, what do you think? You think his politics are just defined by money?
I mean, I had a lot of internal conflict when I was reading the book, and he's obviously praised as a hero there, because I guess he's a hero to the footballers, which makes sense. He's a very controversial person, as I think so I think it's a similar thing everywhere in the world. The football clubs are normally owned by some really rich, shady people. So, and he is a very rich, shady guy. He is basically somebody who made his wealth out of the post-Soviet 90s in Ukraine, as many people did, you know, the clever ones at least, that sort of like saw money like, oh, Ukraine is suddenly becoming very poor, so therefore I can make lots of money with all of things functioning really badly. And, you know, he started some sort of, I think he was involved in some crime groups earlier on in his life, and then he kind of started becoming a prominent figure in the Donbass. He is a Donbass guy himself. He was born and bred there. And that's how he became very rich. And one of the big sort of things that he owns these days is DTAC, is like an alternative energy company that is very big in Ukraine. But he also owns like media outlets. So that impacts the media freedom in those outlets. You know, I would never really read anything that's owned by Akhmetov or any other oligarch in Ukraine. So I had that, I guess, in football terms, it seems like he did really good things for Shakhtar. Outside of football, you know, I would be very careful to praise him for anything. But as you said, last year, as a result of the full-scale invasion, I don't think it was just Akhmetov, I think it was some other rich people in Ukraine that they paid lots of tax up front to the government just to alleviate the suffering of the Ukrainian economy, which I think it was good, this kind of response by oligarchs that, yes, they might be really hated in Ukraine, but they all kind of stood behind Ukraine and did what they could financially.
We've just got time for one more question here. Maria, do you want to pick someone for us and I'll dash over?
Oh God, why is the pressure on me?
Don't pick Dan, he's my friend, he can ask me afterwards.
Okay, so, and Sunny is my friend, he can ask me afterwards. I'll go with this gentleman in the first row.
Hi. I just wanted to know about the response for Ukraine sport, maybe more generally, to the full-scale invasion, or maybe Ukrainian culture. I know that Alex Len, who's a prominent Ukrainian NBA player, spoke out about the invasion last year. Dnipro Kherson have played a lot of exhibition, sort of charity ice hockey games in places like Belfast. So what's the response been for sport more generally in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion?
I mean, you mean among the players or among the fans? And
just sport generally, is sport continued?
Yes, of course, very much so. I mean, I don't know if you follow boxing, there's also lots of Ukrainian talent in boxing. Also being, when you were talking about that and when you were writing about that opera, I think it's the Opera Theatre, isn't it? The restaurant that's opposite the theatre or something like that. That's when I actually had my interview with Alexander Usyk, who's now the heavyweight world champion, who's an absolutely brilliant guy who comes from Crimea and now sort of flies that flag for Ukraine, and you know he's doing fantastic things. He obviously beat Joshua and might have a fight with Tyson Fury if Tyson Fury finally makes up his mind. So there's, I think boxing and football are probably the best sort of fields in terms of sports for Ukrainian talent. But interestingly, there's also two Ukrainian strictly dancers, Nikita Kuzmin, who's doing lots of sort of advocacy for Ukraine as well, and Nadia Bychkova, who comes from the Donbas as well. So they are actually, whether people realize it or not, whether people know that they are Ukrainian, but there are some Ukrainian talent in the country. I really like to follow Usyk. I think he's just I think he's so fascinating. I don't think there's been as many boxers in the history of the world, because it's not just about him being a great boxer, but he's also a great dancer, and he really coordinates his body really well when he fights. It's not just about boxing, it's about being this like multi-talented guy, and I just find it really fascinating, and I think that's how he beats other boxers, because he doesn't just think in terms of punching, but he's also sort of coordinates his body really well.
Well, during one of the Ukrainian Premier League's winter breaks, not the one that's just gone, but the one before, Usyk actually played in a professional team in one of the camps in Antalya.
Was it Veres?
Yeah.
Policia, yeah.
Yeah, and because it's kind of like, I suppose Antalya is kind of like the Hamptons really for New Yorkers. Like the whole Ukrainian Premier League goes there, like every winter break, and does training for like 3 weeks. And Usyk turned out. He didn't turn out last year. He just came and said hello to Dinamo and got himself a bit of free swag from the team and got to meet Lucescu and all that sort of business. But it's interesting. I wasn't expecting to hear the name Alex Len today either. So thank you very much.
Do we have to wrap up now, I guess? Well, thank you once again to everybody who came here. I don't know if you all guys are local or whether you like. It's really, really special for me to have people interested in Ukrainian football and in Shakhtar Donetsk and in Ukraine. Or maybe you just guys follow Andy, and that's why you are here. Maybe you don't care for Ukrainian football, but I'll take anything. So it's been a very, very special occasion for me, and it's been very nice to sort of have this chat. I hope you guys enjoyed it
thank
as
you.
well. And if anybody has any remaining questions, you can always find us. And obviously, Andy's going to do his book signing if anyone's got a book to sign. So again, thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys.